She had been bringing him food for 3 years, every Tuesday. Rain, mud, frozen ground. It didn't matter. And the entire town watched, whispered, and waited for her to finally come to her senses. Because Elena Brooks was 26 years old, sharp-minded, and perfectly capable of building a life with someone her own age. So why did she keep walking across that fence to the man who had already lived his best years? The answer came on an ordinary autumn morning, with an apple pie, an awkward joke, and 7 words that changed everything between them. 7 words she said so quietly, so calmly, that Nathan Wilder didn't sleep for a week afterward. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The sky over Harlan County was the particular shade of gray that promised nothing good. Not rain exactly, not snow either. Just that flat, colorless ceiling that pressed down over the plains in late October, the kind that made the cattle restless and the horses pace along their fence lines, and sensible people question why their ancestors had ever decided to stop moving and build something permanent out here in the middle of all this stubborn, unforgiving land. Elena Brooks had already been up for 4 hours when the sun finally bothered to appear, a pale, half-hearted thing that barely cleared the tree line before hiding again behind a shelf of cloud. She had fed the horses, checked the water troughs, patched a section of fence on the east pasture that the wind had worked loose overnight, and started 2 loads of laundry that would probably still be damp by nightfall because nothing dried properly in this weather. She was 26 years old and she had been running this ranch alone for almost 2 years. Not entirely alone. She had Deb Calloway 3 mornings a week, a 60-year-old woman who came over to help with the books and occasionally with the horses when Elena's workload outpaced her hands. And she had old Walt Pruitt on weekends, a retired ranch hand who still moved like someone half his age and never charged her what he was worth, no matter how many times she tried to pay him properly. But the decisions were hers. The weight of the place was hers. The sleepless nights, and the equipment failures, and the veterinary bills that arrived in clusters, as if all the bad luck had agreed in advance to show up together. All of it landed on Elena Brooks, and she had learned, out of pure necessity, to carry it without letting her knees buckle. Her father had left her the ranch 18 months before he died. Not because he believed she was ready. He told her plainly that he wasn't sure anyone was ever ready for something like this. He'd left it to her because, out of everyone he knew, she was the one least likely to quit. She thought about that sometimes, about whether being the least likely to quit was the same thing as being capable. She'd decided it probably wasn't, but that it would have to do. The pie had been cooling on the kitchen counter since 6 in the morning. Apple, because that was what she'd made last Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that she'd brought cornbread, and the Tuesday before that she'd brought a pot of venison stew that had taken her the better part of an evening to put together. She varied it enough to avoid the impression of routine, though by now it was absolutely routine. 41 Tuesdays. She'd stopped counting somewhere around 30, but she'd gone back and counted properly one evening last spring, and the number had surprised her. 41 times she had crossed the quarter-mile of open ground between her eastern fence line and Nathan Wilder's property, carrying food she'd made with her own hands and leaving it with a man who received it with the quiet, uncomfortable gratitude of someone who had never quite learned how to accept kindness from another person. She wrapped the pie in a clean dish towel, set it in the wide, flat basket she used for these trips, and pulled on her heavy canvas jacket. The walk took about 12 minutes at an easy pace. The ground between their properties was open grazing land, technically hers, right up to the fence line. And at this time of year the grass had gone to a dull gold, flattened in places by the wind, and the whole landscape had that stripped, honest quality that autumn brought to the plains. No hiding anything, no softening anything, just the land as it was, and the sky above it, and the cold working its way through whatever you were wearing if you stood still too long. Elena did not stand still. She moved the way she always moved, purposeful, economical, like someone who had calculated the distance and decided exactly how much energy it warranted. She was not a small woman, but she was lean in the way that ranch work made people lean, and her dark hair was pulled back under a wool hat that she'd had since college, now fraying at the brim in a way she kept meaning to address. The fence between their properties was a 4-strand wire fence, newer on Nathan's side than hers. He'd replaced his section 2 summers ago. Hers still had the original posts her father had set, some of them leaning at angles that suggested they were operating more on stubbornness than structural integrity. There was a gate, an actual hinged gate with a latch, that Nathan had installed after the third or fourth Tuesday. He hadn't mentioned it. He just built it there one week and she'd come the following Tuesday and found it waiting. She'd never commented on it either. That was how most things worked between them. She lifted the latch, passed through, and followed the worn path up toward the house. Nathan Wilder's ranch house sat on a low rise, facing south. Built solid and low in the way, houses on the plains were built when the people who built them were more worried about wind than they were about views. It was a good house. Not beautiful in any conventional sense, but deeply, seriously good. The kind of structure that had been maintained properly for decades, that had weathered things and held together, that had been repaired rather than replaced whenever possible, so that it carried its age the way a working man carried his, in the breadth of the shoulders and the set of the jaw rather than in any softness. Nathan himself was standing on the porch when she came up the rise. He was almost always there on Tuesdays, which meant he was watching for her, which neither of them had ever acknowledged. He was 56 years old, though he could have passed for older some mornings and younger on the days when he'd gotten enough sleep, which wasn't often. He stood 6 feet and change, still carrying the build of a younger man, though his hair had gone fully silver and the lines in his face had deepened into something that stopped being just age and started being history. He had large hands, the kind that had done real work every day for 30 years, and he held them loosely at his sides the way people did when they weren't sure what to do with them. "Morning," he said when she reached the porch steps. "Morning." She held up the basket. "Apple." You didn't have to do that. It was what he said almost every week. Not thank you first, but you didn't have to. She'd noticed that early on, and she'd spent some time thinking about what it meant. She'd decided it meant that receiving things cost him something, that gratitude felt to Nathan Wilder like a kind of debt, and debt made him uncomfortable in the way that certain men were uncomfortable with anything that suggested they couldn't manage entirely on their own. She handed him the basket across the porch railing. She rarely came up the steps, and he rarely invited her to, and neither of them had made an issue of it. And he took it with both hands and lifted the edge of the towel and looked at the pie with the careful expression he brought to most things. "Looks good," he said. "It's not complicated." Still, there was a pause. The wind came through and moved the dry grass in a long, slow wave across the field behind her, and a crow called somewhere off to the east. And Nathan looked at the pie, and Elena looked at the middle distance, and the silence between them was the particular kind that had taken months to develop. Not awkward anymore, not quite comfortable either, but honest. A silence that didn't ask anything of either of them. "Cold today," Nathan said. "Getting colder. Supposed to drop below freezing Thursday." "I heard that." He nodded. She nodded. More silence. This was more or less how their conversations went. She had learned early on not to push him toward warmth. He wasn't ready to produce. Some people took time. Some people took a very long time. Nathan Wilder had spent 3 years with his doors closed and his world narrowed down to cattle prices and fence repairs, and the particular discipline of a man who has decided that surviving is the most he can ask of himself. And Elena had understood from the beginning that you didn't push a man like that. You showed up, you brought food, you let the silence be what it was. What she had not anticipated, what no one could have anticipated, including her, was that after 3 years of Tuesdays, she had come to understand this man better than most people understood their closest friends. She knew how he moved when something was bothering him. She knew the difference between his comfortable silences and his painful ones. She knew that he drank his coffee black, but always hesitated before the first sip, as if waiting for it to be something other than what it was. She knew that he checked the sky the way sailors checked it. Not casually, but with the serious attention of someone whose livelihood depended on being right. She knew that on the anniversary of his wife's death, the 15th of September, he didn't come to the porch when she arrived, but left the door of the barn open so she'd know to leave the food on the porch rail and go without knocking. She knew him, not completely, not the way she might have known him if he had ever let himself fully open. But enough. She knew enough, and she was not, had never been, indifferent to what she knew. Deb. She had turned to go, the usual ending of a Tuesday visit, a nod, a see you next week left unspoken, when Nathan said something that surprised her. "I heard Caleb Thornton's been sniffing around." She turned back. Nathan was still holding the basket, not looking at her, looking out over the south field where 3 of his horses were standing in a loose group near the water tank. "He asked me to dinner," she said. "What did you tell him?" She studied the side of his face. He had the look he got when he was asking a question he didn't entirely want the answer to. "I told him maybe." Nathan nodded, slowly, like he was filing something away. "He's a good man. So people keep telling me. Young. People keep telling me that too." Another silence, but this one had a different texture. Nathan shifted his weight and looked at the pie again, and then looked somewhere between her and the horizon and made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, cut short by something. Self-consciousness, maybe, or the habit of keeping himself small. "Must be nice," he said, "having someone like that interested." He paused. "Someone your own age." Elena looked at him. "Why do you say it like that?" "Like what? Like it's settled. Like age is the only thing that matters." Nathan finally met her eyes. He looked slightly caught out, the way people looked when they'd been thinking something private and someone had seen it. "Doesn't it?" he said. "Out here, I mean, practically speaking." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said it. Quietly, without drama, without the weight she might have given it if she'd been trying to make a point. 20 years wouldn't change anything, and she walked away. She didn't look back. She went through the gate, latched it behind her, and walked across the open ground toward her own fence line. And the wind came against her, and the sky stayed its particular cold gray, and she was aware, without turning around, that he was standing there on that porch watching her go. She had not planned to say it. It wasn't a speech she'd prepared. It had come out of her the way true things sometimes came out, suddenly and without warning, from a place she hadn't known was ready to speak. By the time she reached her own porch, her heart was beating harder than the walk warranted. She didn't know if she'd done something foolish or something brave. Sometimes those were the same thing. Nathan stood on that porch for longer than he would have admitted to anyone. The wind worked through his jacket and he ignored it. The horses at the water tank lifted their heads and looked at him with the mild and curious gaze that horses sometimes directed at humans who were behaving strangely, and he ignored them too. He was looking at the place where Elena had disappeared behind the tree line at the edge of his south pasture, as if the air there still held the shape of her. 20 years wouldn't change anything. He turned the phrase over in his head the way you'd turn a stone over in your hand, looking for the angle that made sense of it, for the flat face that would tell you what you were really holding. She might have meant it simply. She might have meant that she didn't care about age in general, that it seemed unfair to assume a younger man was automatically preferable. That was a reasonable reading, a charitable reading, the kind of reading a sensible man would arrive at and be satisfied with and carry into his house and put down and leave alone. Nathan was not, in this particular moment, capable of being sensible. He went inside, set the basket on the kitchen table, and stood in the middle of his own kitchen for a moment in the way he sometimes stood in rooms, as if he'd entered them for a reason he couldn't quite remember. The kitchen was clean. It was always clean. He'd become meticulous about the house in the years since Margaret died, not out of any love of order, but because having something to control, counters to wipe, floors to sweep, dishes to wash, gave the hands something to do during the hours when the mind was doing things the hands couldn't help with. Margaret. He let himself think the name, which he didn't always do voluntarily. Some days it came at him without permission, in the middle of other things, in the sound of the coffee percolating, in the weight of the blanket on his side of the bed, in the smell of whatever the air was doing before a storm. Those days were getting less frequent, which people told him was healthy and which had produced in him a complicated guilt, as if recovering was in some way a betrayal. He and Margaret had been together for 22 years. They'd built this ranch from a piece of land and a shared stubbornness, and she had been the brighter half of everything. Funnier, warmer, better with people, quicker to reach across whatever distance had opened between them. He was the one who knew how to work. She was the one who knew how to live. He'd loved her with the full weight of himself, and when she died, a stroke, sudden and complete at 51, which was an age that had seemed young to him then and still seemed impossibly young to him now. He'd understood for the first time what people meant when they described grief as something physical. It had settled in his chest like a stone, not sharp, just permanently, specifically there. That was 3 years ago. He picked up the kettle, filled it, set it to boil, made himself go through the motions of an ordinary morning. But the phrase kept coming back. 20 years wouldn't change anything. He was 56. She was 26. The arithmetic was what it was, a 30-year gap that anyone in Harlan County could do in their head and draw conclusions from without needing any further information. He'd done the arithmetic himself more times than he would ever confess, and every time he'd arrived at the same number and the same verdict. Don't be an old fool. Except Elena Brooks had been coming to his fence every Tuesday for 3 years, and she was not. He knew her well enough now to be certain of this, a woman who did things out of pity. He'd tested that theory in the first few months. He'd been deliberately short with her, not cruel but distant in the way he could be distant when he was trying to protect something. He'd stood at that porch railing with the specific body language of a man who wanted to be left alone, and she had handed him food anyway, and said whatever quiet, practical thing she'd come prepared to say, and walked back across the field without any drama. She wasn't doing it because she felt sorry for him. He'd eliminated that possibility a long time ago. What she was doing, why she kept coming, was a question he'd been careful not to look at directly. The way you avoided looking directly at the sun, because some things, looked at directly, required a response. He made his coffee, sat down at the table, looked at the apple pie in its dish towel wrapping, still faintly warm. 20 years wouldn't change anything. He thought about Caleb Thornton. He'd met the man twice, once at the feed store in town, once at the county fair last summer. And his honest assessment was that Caleb was exactly what everyone said he was. Good-looking, well-off, socially capable. The kind of man who made things look easy, because he'd never been in a situation where they genuinely weren't. He was 29 years old, and he ran a successful dry goods operation, and he had the comfortable confidence of someone who had never had to question whether he deserved a seat at the table. There was nothing wrong with Caleb Thornton. That was the most frustrating thing about him. Nathan sat with his coffee and thought about the things he was not, at 56, and the list was depressingly long. He was not young. He was not uncomplicated. He was not easy to know. He carried weight that he sometimes couldn't put down even when he wanted to. He woke at odd hours and lay staring at a ceiling that hadn't changed in 3 years, and thought thoughts he didn't share with anyone because there was no one to share them with. He was a man who had loved once, completely, and had been remade by losing it. That was not nothing. It wasn't even necessarily a bad thing. But it was not, by any measurement, the clean slate that a woman of 26 deserved to be walking into. He drank his coffee. It was good coffee. Elena had once brought him a bag of beans from a place in Salida, and he'd been buying the same brand ever since. He'd never told her that. There were a lot of things he hadn't told her. He got up, washed his cup, put on his jacket, and went out to start the morning. But the phrase stayed with him, all through the work, through checking on the cattle in the east pasture, through replacing a busted gate hinge, through the long afternoon of sorting through the hay inventory and making notes about what he'd need to order before December. It sat underneath everything else like a low constant sound. 20 years wouldn't change anything. He still hadn't decided what it meant by the time he went to bed. The town of Harlan, population roughly 400, spread across a valley, and the surrounding ranch land, like a handful of seeds thrown without particular intention, had been a consistent source of opinions about Elena Brooks for as long as Elena could remember. When her father got sick, the town had opinions about whether she'd stay or go. When she stayed, the town had opinions about whether a woman that age could really manage a working ranch. When she proved she could, the town's opinions shifted slightly and became more general, more about her life choices, her future, the things she hadn't yet done that a woman of 26 ought to be getting on with. Harlan was not a cruel place. It was in its way a community that looked out for its own. But it was also a place where people had known each other long enough to feel entitled to comment on each other's decisions. And Elena Brooks had been the subject of more commentary than she would have chosen. "You've been over there again." This was Ruth Ann Phelps, who worked the counter at the post office and who had known Elena since Elena was 7 years old and who had never, in all that time, found a way to state a thing without the particular tone that made it sound like an accusation and a question at once. "Just dropped off some food," Elena said, collecting her mail. There wasn't much. A bill, a seed catalog she'd ordered months ago and forgotten about. A water district notice. People are talking. People are always talking, Ruth Ann. About Nathan Wilder. Elena folded the bill and put it in her coat pocket. Nathan Wilder is my neighbor. I've been neighbors with him for 6 years. There's neighbors, Ruth Ann said meaningfully, and there's neighbors. Elena smiled at her, the specific smile she used for situations where any other expression would create more problems than it solved. Have a good afternoon. Outside, the cold had sharpened into actual wind. She stood on the post office steps and breathed for a moment, watching the main street go about its mid-morning business. 2 ranch trucks idling outside the hardware store. A group of women her mother's age standing in front of the cafe in a cluster that suggested they'd been standing there for some time. She saw Caleb Thornton before he saw her. He was coming out of his shop, the dry goods store that took up the nicest building on the main block, with its freshly painted sign and its clean windows. And he had that particular way of walking that handsome, prosperous men sometimes had. Slightly forward-leaning, like the world was already agreeing to go in the same direction he was going. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and his coat was better quality than anyone else's on the street. And he spotted her, and his face arranged itself into a smile that was, she had to admit, genuinely nice. Caleb Thornton had a genuinely nice smile. That was simply true. Elena. He changed course toward her without appearing to make any effort at all. I was going to come by your place this afternoon. I saved you the trip. I was hoping you'd thought about dinner. I've thought about it. He waited. He was good at waiting, patient in a way that was probably deliberate, but that she couldn't fault him for. And she looked at him. She was trying, honestly trying, to see him the way everyone else seemed to see him, as the obvious answer to a question she was obviously asking. He was kind. He was successful. He was, by every conventional measure, a better prospect than a 56-year-old widower with closed-off rooms and a stone in his chest. You're a good man, Caleb, she said. Something in his expression flickered. He'd heard enough compliments to know when one was being offered as a consolation. But? No but. I just need more time. He nodded slowly. How much time? She didn't have an answer for that. She smiled at him, the genuine one this time. Not the post office smile, but the one that actually reached something, and said, I'll let you know, and went to her truck. In the cab, with the engine warming, she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel and looked at nothing in particular. She thought about Nathan standing on his porch, about the particular quality of his attention when she was near him. Not aggressive, not performative, but there. Fully present in a way that some people never were. As if her presence actually registered with him as something specific and important, not just another variable in his day. She thought about the gate he'd built without being asked. She thought about the morning last January when she'd arrived to find that her east fence, the long section closest to his property, had been entirely replaced overnight, new posts and fresh wire, and she'd never said a word about it because she didn't need to. She thought about the way he'd said someone your own age, like he was making an argument he'd been having with himself for a while and had finally said out loud. She drove home through the cold, and the land spread out around her, big and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that things were beautiful when they were old enough not to care whether you appreciated them. The thing about Nathan Wilder was that he never made a show of anything. This was a quality that people who didn't know him might have mistaken for coldness or for a lack of investment in the world around him. It was neither. It was simply the way he'd been built, or the way life had rebuilt him, and it expressed itself in actions rather than words, in things done quietly rather than announced. In the 3 years since Elena had started her Tuesday visits, Nathan had done a number of things for her that she was only partially aware of. He'd fixed her east fence. She knew that one. What she didn't know, the morning after a major thunderstorm in May, when she'd still been inside dealing with a flooding issue near the barn. He'd driven his truck along her property line at 5 a.m. to check for damage, and had repaired 2 sections of fencing and cleared a blocked drainage ditch before she'd even gotten her boots on. She didn't know that when her truck had broken down outside of town the previous February, she'd called Walt Pruitt for a ride, and Walt had come. Nathan had already been on his way. He'd turned back when he saw Walt's truck already there. He'd never mentioned it. She didn't know that at the county meeting about the water rights dispute that had been dragging through their corner of the valley for 2 years, Nathan had made an argument, quietly, with the particular authority that came from being someone who didn't speak often but was listened to when he did, that had protected her allocation. She'd won that dispute without ever fully understanding why, and Nathan hadn't connected it to himself when she'd thanked him generally for his support. He did things, quietly, without a ledger. Not because he expected anything in return, but because there was, in Nathan Wilder's moral architecture, a very clear sense of what a person owed to the people around them, and that sense operated regardless of what those people might or might not mean to him personally. But Elena meant something to him personally. He'd known it for about a year. He'd been careful with the knowledge, treating it the way you treated a piece of equipment you weren't sure was trustworthy. Useful, maybe, but requiring caution. You didn't build your whole operation around something you hadn't fully tested. The problem was that this particular thing was resistant to testing. You couldn't run a trial on it without consequences. You couldn't assess it objectively from the outside. It was inside him, which meant whatever he did with it was going to involve the rest of him too. On the Thursday after the apple pie, 2 days after she'd said those 7 words and walked away, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with a glass of whiskey, not working, not watching anything, just sitting, thinking. He was thinking about the last time he'd allowed himself to want something for himself, rather than just managing what was already in front of him. He genuinely couldn't remember. That struck him, after a while, as a problem. The following Sunday, he drove into town for supplies. He didn't usually do this on Sundays. He preferred weekdays when it was quieter, but he'd run low on coffee, and he used the coffee as the reason, even though the actual reason was that he'd been in the house for 4 days with the same thought circling, and he needed to be somewhere that had other sounds in it. He ran into Hector Ramos at the feed store. Hector was 72, retired now, had run cattle in the county for 40 years, and was one of the people whose opinion Nathan actually valued, which was a short list. "You look tired," Hector said, which was his standard greeting. "I'm always tired. This is a different kind of tired." Hector looked at him with the appraising eye of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading animals and had extended the skill to people. "You eating?" "I have more food than I know what to do with." "I heard Elena Brooks brings you pies." Nathan looked at him. "I heard it somewhere," Hector said without any particular expression. "She's a good neighbor. She's a good woman." "Yes." Hector picked up a sack of mineral supplement and tucked it under one arm with an ease that belied his age. "You know what my wife told me when we were young? She told me the worst thing a man can do is talk himself out of his own life." He paused. "I thought that was just something she said. Took me about 10 years to figure out she was right." "I don't know what you're—" "Yes, you do." Hector picked up a second sack. "I'll see you, Nathan." Nathan stood in the feed store aisle with a bag of coffee in his hand and watched Hector walk away and felt, for the first time in longer than he could track, something that wasn't grief or determination or exhaustion. He felt, faintly and suspiciously, something that might have been hope. He didn't trust it yet, but he noted its presence. The dinner at Ruth Ann's, the cafe where Ruth Ann Phelps worked evenings, in addition to her post office mornings, because Ruth Ann Phelps was nothing if not omnipresent, happened on a Friday night in early November, and it was not, despite Caleb's careful planning, what he'd hoped. He'd reserved the corner table. He'd arrived early to make sure everything was right. He'd dressed well, in the understated way of someone who had money and didn't need to announce it. He stood up when Elena came in from the cold, and he thought, watching her cross the room, her cheeks reddened from the wind, her coat slightly too big and her boots not remotely the right shoes for a dinner, that she was genuinely, distractingly beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with any effort she'd made. "Hi," she said, sitting across from him. "Hot day," he smiled. "Cold out there." "Getting worse," they ordered. Caleb was good at dinner conversation. He'd had practice. He moved in circles where it was a skill, and he made it easy, steering them through topics that felt natural without requiring too much. The water rights case, the feed prices, whether the winter would be as hard as the forecasters were predicting. Elena was a good conversationalist when she was interested. She was funny, occasionally, in a dry way that he liked. She asked real questions, not social ones. She was present, but she was not, and he could feel this without being able to exactly locate its source, there. She was in the conversation. She just wasn't in the room in the way that mattered. Some part of her was somewhere else, and he couldn't reach it, and he was experienced enough with people to know when that gap was something time might close and when it was permanent. He asked, toward the end of the meal, when they were both looking at half-finished desserts, "Are you happy, Elena?" She looked up. The question had surprised her. He could see that. "In general," he added, I'm just asking. Because sometimes you look like a person who has something very specific on their mind, and I can't tell if that's just how you are or if it's something I should know about." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the cafe window, a few flakes of snow were starting to find their way down through the streetlight. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm someone who knows what she wants and is trying to figure out whether wanting it is practical." "That sounds exhausting." "It is, a little." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, because he was actually a good man, he said, "Is it Nathan Wilder?" She didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. She held his gaze and said, "I don't know," which was honest and which told him more than a yes would have. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and finished it. He wasn't shattered. He was disappointed, which was different and less complicated. He'd been honest with himself about his odds for some time. "He's a good man," Caleb said. "Difficult, I think, but good." "I know." "You deserve good." She looked at him with something that was almost but not quite sadness. "So do you, Caleb." He smiled. It was a smaller smile than the one he'd come in with, but it was a real one. "I'll be fine." He paid for the dinner. She let him, which meant something. She wasn't the type to let people pay for things that came with obligations she didn't intend to fulfill. The fact that she let him told him it was a goodbye of sorts, and he received it as one. They walked out together into the snow. It was coming down in earnest now, the first real snow of the season, the kind that stuck. "Drive safe," he said. "You too." He watched her truck's taillights disappear down the main street, and then he stood in the snow for a minute, breathing cold air, making peace with the way things were. He thought about the woman in that truck, and about Nathan Wilder's fence, and his silence, and all those Tuesdays. And he thought, with a rueful clarity that was maybe the most honest emotion of the night, some fights you don't win because the other person already did, before you even got to the table. He walked back to his shop, let himself in, stood in the dark for a minute. Then he turned on the lights and went to work on the invoices he'd been putting off. There was always work. That, at least, was reliable. On a Wednesday morning, the day between his Tuesdays, the day closest to the visit just past and furthest from the one coming, Nathan did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He opened the door to the room at the end of the hall. It had been Margaret's room, not their bedroom. That was where he still slept, in the same bed, stubbornly refusing to concede it, but the small room at the end of the hall where she'd kept her things. Her craft supplies, her books, the writing desk her mother had left her, the particular collection of objects that people accumulate over a lifetime, each one freighted with some memory or other, and which Nathan had found 3 years ago completely impossible to move or change or look at too long. So he'd closed the door, and he'd kept it closed. He stood in the doorway now and let his eyes adjust. The room smelled like dust, and something underneath the dust that was her, or was his memory of her, or was just the imagination doing what it did when grief was involved. He breathed it in, carefully, the way you breathed in something that might hurt. It did hurt, but not the way it had. The stone was still there, in his chest, but it had changed shape over 3 years, worn smooth, like river rock, by the constant motion of surviving. Still heavy, just less sharp. He looked at the desk, her books, the quilting things she'd collected and only sometimes used. A photograph of the two of them at the county fair, maybe 15 years ago, both of them looking younger than he remembered feeling at the time. He thought about what she would have said. This was the thing he did, still, sometimes. He was aware it was probably not entirely healthy. But Margaret had been, in many ways, his better judgment, and without her he sometimes needed to imagine what she would have said in order to hear the version of himself that was actually thinking clearly. She would not have said, "Be careful." She would have said, and he could hear it so clearly it almost didn't feel like imagination, "Nathan Wilder, you are 60 years old in 4 years, and you are standing in a closed room instead of living in your own house. And I have been gone 3 years, and you have been standing still for all of them, and that is long enough." He stood in the doorway a while longer. Then he went to find a dust cloth. Tuesday came back around. Elena made cornbread this time. She wrapped it in foil and put it in the basket and went through the gate at the usual time, and the sky was gray again, but a different gray. Softer, more tired looking. The kind that came in November when it had already committed to winter but hadn't quite gotten around to delivering on the promise. Nathan was on the porch. She came up the rise and she could see, as she got closer, that something was different. Not dramatically. He was still standing the same way, hands loose at his sides, face giving nothing away. But the door behind him was open. He'd never left it open before. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She held up the basket. "Cornbread." "Thank you," he said, without the "you didn't have to" first. Just "thank you" directly, without the buffer. She handed it across the railing. He took it, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the wind came through and moved things around gently, and somewhere in one of the outbuildings a horse made a sound. "I've been thinking," Nathan said, "about what you said last week." "I know. You can't just say something like that and walk away." "I didn't know what else to say after it." He looked at her, really looked, the full weight of his attention, which was considerable when he didn't filter it. "What did you mean?" Elena set her hand on the top rail of the fence. Not dramatically, just something to hold on to. "I meant exactly what I said." "Elena." "Nathan." She said his name the way he'd said hers, with the same particular weight, the same request for honesty. "I'm not 26 because I want someone 26. I'm 26 because that's how old I am. Those are different things." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually processing something, not deflecting. "I'm 56, he said. "I know how old you are." I'm not. I'm not easy. I know that. I'm not asking you to be easy. I've got things." He stopped. Tried again. "There are parts of this, of me, that are still, I don't know, not right. I know that too." He stared at her. "That doesn't bother you?" "It would bother me more if you pretended otherwise." He looked out over the field. She watched the side of his face, the muscle in his jaw, the way he breathed through the nose when he was thinking hard. She wasn't afraid of whatever he was going to say. That was the thing she'd discovered about herself somewhere in the last 3 years. She wasn't afraid of him. She had been cautious at first, the way you were cautious around someone who had been hurt, because hurt things could be unpredictable. But Nathan Wilder, she had learned, was the opposite of unpredictable. He was the most consistently, reliably himself person she had ever known. That was exactly what she admired about him. Not his age, not his history, not the tragedy of what he'd been through, just the bedrock fact of what he was. "I can't promise," he said finally, "that I know how to do this." "I'm not asking for a promise." "Then what are you asking for?" She thought about it, the honest answer. "I'm asking you to stop talking yourself out of it." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He went inside, just briefly, 30 seconds, and came back with 2 cups of coffee. He held one over the railing toward her. She looked at it. Then she came up the porch steps for the first time in 3 years of Tuesdays and took the cup from his hand. They stood on the porch together in the cold gray morning and drank their coffee, and didn't say much of anything, and the silence had a new quality to it. Not the careful silence of 2 people maintaining a comfortable distance, but the fuller, warmer silence of 2 people who had stepped closer and were deciding what to do about it. The door behind them was still open. Neither of them had closed it. The coffee cup stayed on Elena's side of the porch railing for 3 days before she remembered to bring it back. Not because she forgot. She wasn't the forgetting type, but because returning it would have required her to figure out what to say about the morning she'd taken it, and she hadn't worked that out yet. It sat on her kitchen windowsill above the sink, a plain white mug with a small chip on the handle, and every morning when she washed up after breakfast, she looked at it and thought about Nathan standing beside her on that porch, both of them holding something warm and not saying much, and the open door behind them, and the particular quality of that silence. She'd climbed his porch steps. That was not a small thing. She'd been thinking about what came next when the town of Harlan decided, collectively and without being asked, to have an opinion about it. It started, These things always started somewhere small, with a comment Ruth Ann Phelps made at the cafe on a Saturday morning, in the presence of 4 women who each told 2 people, who each told 2 more, with the geometric efficiency that small communities had always applied to other people's business. What Ruth Ann said, apparently, was that she'd heard Elena Brooks had turned down Caleb Thornton's dinner invitation a second time, and that it was a shame, and that some women didn't know a good thing when it was standing right in front of them. That was the polite version. The version that made it back to Elena, filtered through Deb Calloway on a Tuesday morning while Deb was going through the accounts at the kitchen table, was more direct. "They're saying you've set your sights on Nathan Wilder," Deb said, without looking up from the ledger. Deb had a gift for delivering difficult information as if she were reading it from a document. Elena was washing the breakfast dishes. She kept washing them. "Who's they?" "Ruth Ann to start with. But it spread. It always spreads. They think you're making a mistake. They thought I was making a mistake when I decided to keep the ranch too." Deb looked up then. She was a straight-backed woman with steel gray hair and the specific patience of someone who had watched a lot of other people's lives unfold and had come to conclusions about most of them. She had known Elena's father. She had watched Elena grow up. She was more than most people in Harlan, someone whose opinion actually carried weight with Elena, which was exactly why Elena kept her back turned and her hands in the soapy water. "That was different," Deb said. "How? The ranch was yours. It's more complicated. Most things worth doing are." Deb was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's 30 years older than you. I know how old he is. His wife has been gone 3 years. I know that too. People will say..." Elena set the last dish in the rack and turned around, drying her hands on the kitchen towel. She looked at Deb steadily, the way she'd learned to look at things she didn't intend to back down from. "Deb, I'm not asking permission. I'm not asking for an opinion. I'm telling you what people are saying so I know what's in the air. That's useful. But what they think about it isn't going to change what I do." Deb held her gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the ledger. "Fair enough," she said, which was as close as Deb Calloway got to admitting she'd overstepped. Elena put the towel on its hook and looked out the window at the gray November morning and thought about what she'd just said and whether she entirely believed it. She wanted to. She was working on it. The truth was that the town's opinions didn't change what she felt, but they had a way of accumulating, like snow, not individually heavy, but piling up until you noticed the weight. She was 26, and she'd been managing other people's commentary on her life since she was 22, and she'd developed a reasonable tolerance for it. But there was a difference between tolerating commentary on your business decisions and tolerating commentary on something that lived this close to the center of you. She went out to feed the horses and told herself she was fine. She was mostly fine. Nathan, meanwhile, was not fine at all, though he wouldn't have used that word. He would have said he was working through something, which was how he described any internal process that inconvenienced him. What he was working through was this. He had let Elena Brooks up onto his porch. He had given her coffee. He had stood beside her in the cold, and he had not said the careful distancing thing that would have put them back on safe ground. And now the ground was different, and he wasn't sure how to stand on it. He kept the end of hall room open now. That had happened. He dusted it and opened the curtain on the single window and found that the morning light came in at a particular angle that had always been there, clearly, and that he'd been blocking for 3 years by keeping the door shut. He wasn't ready to change anything in the room yet, but he stopped walking past it like it was a wall. Small things. He was a man who understood that large shifts happened through small things over time. What he was less practiced at was the uncertainty, the not knowing what the small things were adding up to, or what they were supposed to. He could fix a fence in the dark by feel. He could read weather a day out from the color of the horizon. He did not know, with any confidence, how to be a man who was allowing himself to want something again, and the not knowing sat in him like an unfamiliar piece of machinery, possibly useful, definitely loud. He was in the east pasture checking on a heifer who'd been off her feed for 2 days when he heard a truck coming up his drive. He didn't recognize it until it got closer. A newer model, cleaner than anything most of the ranchers in the area drove. And then he recognized it and felt the particular preparedness that came with encountering something you'd been vaguely expecting. Caleb Thornton parked at the edge of the field and got out. He was wearing a good coat and good boots, and he picked his way across the frozen ground with the careful dignity of a man who was aware his footwear was wrong for the terrain, but was committed to seeing this through anyway. Nathan waited. Caleb stopped a few feet away. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the heifer for a moment, the way men did when they needed a neutral starting point. "She eat today?" "A little. I think it's the cold more than anything." "Yeah." A pause. "You know why I'm here?" "I've got a guess." Caleb looked at him directly. He had good eyes. Honest, Nathan thought, which was a thing he looked for and respected. "I'm not here to make trouble. I want you to know that." "All right. I just want to understand something." Caleb shifted his weight. The cold was working on him. He wasn't built for standing in frozen fields, not the way Nathan was. "She's a good woman, you know that." "I do." I think she has a version of her life in her head, and I think it involves someone specific." He paused. "I think that someone is you." Nathan looked at the heifer. She'd moved closer to the fence, which meant she was better than yesterday. He noted this in the part of his mind that kept running numbers on the world around him, even when the other part was occupied with something else. "What do you want me to say?" Nathan asked. "Nothing, probably. I just want to know if you're taking this seriously, what she's offering, because she doesn't do things halfway. And if you're going to treat this like it's not something she should take seriously, then I'd rather—" He stopped himself, reorganized. "I'd rather she knew that early." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up and moved through the dead grass, and the heifer turned her head. "I don't know what I'm doing," Nathan said. It came out more honest than he'd intended. "I'll tell you that straight. I don't have a clear plan. I don't know how this works. I'm 56 years old, and I'd made certain decisions about what my life was going to look like, and she—" He stopped. "She doesn't make it easy to hold on to those decisions." Caleb looked at him. "That's either a very good sign or a very bad one." "I know." Another silence. Caleb pulled his coat tighter. "She deserves someone who shows up," he said. "Not perfectly, just present, consistent." "I've been showing up for 3 years," Nathan said quietly. "Just not the way that counted." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and said, "Fair enough." He turned back toward his truck, then turned back around. "For what it's worth, I think you're a good man. I don't think you're the wrong man for her. I just couldn't live with myself if I didn't say it to your face." "I wouldn't expect anything less." Caleb almost smiled. He went back to his truck and drove away without hurrying, and Nathan watched him go and thought that there were worse things than being checked on by a decent man. He went back to watching the heifer. She put her head down and started pulling at some of the dried grass near the fence post, eating on her own. He'd keep an eye on her, but she was going to be fine. He thought about what Caleb had said. Present. Consistent. He thought about 41 Tuesdays. He thought about someone who had been showing up long before he was ready to notice. The following Tuesday, Elena came through the gate with a pot of chicken soup she'd made the night before. The kind that took actual time, a low simmer for hours, stock made from scratch. She'd made it because it was cold and soup made sense in cold weather. She told herself it had nothing to do with anything else. Nathan was on the porch. He'd left the main door open behind him again, not just ajar, but properly open, and through it she could see the warm light of the kitchen. "Soup," she said, coming up the steps without being invited because they were past that now, apparently. She handed him the pot with both hands. He took it and looked at her and then looked at the pot and said, "You didn't have to," and then caught himself visibly and said instead, "Thank you, really." She smiled. "You almost did it. Old habit." "I know." He held the door open for her and she went inside. This was new. She'd never been inside his kitchen before. She'd stood on the porch for 3 years and handed things over the rail, and she'd looked through the window sometimes on winter mornings, but she'd never been inside the house. The kitchen was plain and serious and cleaner than most ranch kitchens she'd been in, which were often clean in a functional way, but this was clean in a careful way, the way of someone who had imposed order on a space because the order helped him cope. She registered this without commenting on it. He put the pot on the stove and she sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, because it was cold and the kitchen was warm, and because the sitting down felt important, like another small renegotiation of the terms between them. He poured her coffee without asking. He'd remembered she took hers with milk. She noticed that he'd remembered. "Caleb came to see me," Nathan said, sitting down across from her. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I know. He told me." "What did he tell you?" "That he'd said his piece and was going to leave it alone." She paused. "He's a good man." "That's what I told him." "Everyone seems to agree on that." "Everyone also seems to have opinions about you." She looked up. "I heard." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "Does it bother you, what they're saying?" "It bothers me a little," she said, because lying about it would have been too easy. "Not because they're wrong about the facts. They're not wrong that you're older. They're not wrong that it's unconventional. They're wrong about what that means, but they're not working from invented information." "What do you think it means?" She thought about it, genuinely considered the question the way he'd asked it, not as a challenge, but as a real inquiry. "I think it means that people see the surface of something and construct a whole story around it. They see the years between us and they build a narrative, that I'm confused, or that I don't know what I'm doing, or that you're taking advantage, or that I'm, I don't know, filling in something that's missing." She shook her head. "None of that is true. But it's easier than the actual story, which is harder to explain." "What's the actual story?" She looked at him across the kitchen table. The pot on the stove was starting to heat, and the smell of it was filling the room, and the light was the kind of kitchen light that was warm without trying to be anything. "The actual story," she said, "is that I spent 3 years getting to know someone, and the more I knew him, the more I thought, this is someone worth knowing. That's it. That's the whole story. The rest of it is details." Nathan looked at her for a long time. There was something working in his expression, not quite emotion, or not just emotion, but the specific face of a man recalibrating, taking in new information and figuring out where to put it. "I talked to Hector Ramos," he said finally. "What did Hector say?" "He said the worst thing a man can do is talk himself out of his own life." "Hector's a smart man." "He is." A pause. "I've been doing that, talking myself out of it. I want you to know I'm aware of that. I know you're aware of it. I'm not going to promise I'll stop entirely. Old habits." "I'm not asking for promises," she said. The same thing she'd said on the porch. She meant it the same way. "I'm just asking you not to make decisions for me. I'm capable of deciding what I'm getting into." He nodded, slowly. "Okay." "Okay," she said. They sat with their coffee in the warm kitchen and the soup heated on the stove, and outside the wind had picked up enough to make the window glass vibrate faintly in its frame, a sound so constant on this part of the plains that neither of them registered it consciously anymore. After a while, Nathan said, "I opened the room at the end of the hall." She didn't ask which room. She understood which room. She'd known, in the vague way you knew things about people you'd paid attention to for 3 years, that there was a room he didn't go into. She'd never asked about it. "How was that?" she asked. "Hard." He looked at his cup. "Better than I expected." "Both things can be true." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not over her. I want you to know that. I think that's just a thing that's permanent. Is that..." He stopped, looked at her with something close to apology. "Is that something you can live with?" Elena held his gaze. She thought carefully about what was true before she spoke. "I'm not asking you to be over her. I'm not asking to replace her. I'd never ask that." She paused. "I'm asking to be something that exists alongside that, something new, not in competition with what was." The relief on his face was brief and unguarded, the kind of expression that slipped through when a person wasn't watching for it. "I don't know how to do this gracefully," he said. "Nathan," she almost smiled, "look at the two of us. Gracefully was never going to be an option." He actually laughed at that. Not the short, uncomfortable sound he sometimes produced, but a real laugh. Low and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. And it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and lighter, and like a version of himself that had been around before the stone settled in his chest. She thought, there he is. She kept the thought to herself, but she held on to it. The soup was ready by then, and he got up and found 2 bowls, and she didn't offer to help because he needed to do something with his hands. And they ate together at the kitchen table with the wind working at the windows and the light holding steady overhead. And it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, and it was the best Tuesday either of them had had in a long time. What neither of them said, because saying it would have been too much too soon, was that this felt like the beginning of something. What Harlan said over the following 2 weeks was considerably louder. Frank Bauer, who ran the largest spread in the county and whose opinion carried the specific weight of a man who had been around long enough to feel that his longevity entitled him to pronouncements, said at a feed store gathering that Nathan Wilder was making a fool of himself chasing a woman young enough to be his daughter. He said it to a group of 4 men, 2 of whom disagreed but said nothing, one of whom agreed loudly, and one of whom was Hector Ramos, who simply turned and walked away, which was its own kind of statement. Martha Clive, who taught at the county school and was generally considered one of the more thoughtful voices in the community, told her sister that she worried about Elena, that a young woman in Elena's position, isolated on a ranch, managing something difficult alone, might be confusing gratitude and dependence with something else. Her sister told her that Elena Brooks was neither isolated nor dependent, and that confusing her with someone who couldn't manage her own feelings was a mistake. But Martha Clive was the type who worried on general principles and was not easily redirected. The reverberations reached Elena in pieces. A concerned look from someone she'd known for years. A conversation that went quiet when she walked into the feed store. Ruth Ann at the post office, professional now, carefully neutral, which was in some ways worse than the commentary. She bore all of it with the same steady exterior she brought to equipment failures and weather disasters, and the 1,000 small indignities of running a place alone. She did not confront people. She did not explain herself to those who hadn't asked. She went to the post office and the feed store and Ruth Ann's cafe, and she was courteous to everyone, and she did not give the town the satisfaction of watching her doubt herself. But she called her college friend Piper one evening, Piper who lived in Denver now, and who was the person Elena trusted most completely, because Piper had known her before she had anything to prove to anyone. "They think I'm confused," Elena said. She was sitting on her porch in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the lights from Nathan's place visible across the field. "Or naive, okay, I don't know, filling some kind of void left by my dad." "Are you?" Piper asked. Not cruelly, just directly because that was how they talked. Elena thought about it seriously. "No," she said. "I've thought about it. I've really tried to see it the way they see it. And I don't think that's what this is." "What is it?" "It's—" She stopped, tried to find the right words, which was harder than she expected. "You know how sometimes you meet someone and the longer you know them, the more you see, and what you see keeps being more? Like the picture keeps getting bigger and better rather than smaller?" Piper was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "I know that feeling. That's what it is. That's all it is. It's just that the person it's happening with is 30 years older than me, so everybody thinks there must be something wrong with me." "There might not be anything wrong with you," Piper said. "But you know you're signing up for complicated, right? Not just the age thing. A man that age who's lost someone. That's not easy even when everything else is working." "I know." "You really know, or you know, but you think you'll handle it." Elena looked at Nathan's lights across the field. She thought about his kitchen and his coffee and the way he laughed, that rusty, unpracticed sound, and the room at the end of the hall that he'd finally opened. "I know," she said. "Both kinds." Piper made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sigh. "Then do what you're going to do, and tell the town to mind its own ranch." Elena smiled into the dark. "That's roughly the plan." She went inside and looked at the white mug on her windowsill. She'd returned it and taken it back again, which hadn't been intentional. It had just been on the tray with the empty soup pot. And she thought about what she was doing and whether she was afraid. She was, a little. Not of him, not of the town, of the specific vulnerability of caring about something enough that losing it would cost you. She'd been there before, with her father, with the ranch in its bad seasons, with the version of her future she'd imagined as a younger person, before life had demonstrated its preference for going sideways. She understood now that you didn't get to opt out of that vulnerability. You either went toward the things that mattered and carried the risk, or you stayed safe and lived a smaller life. She had never been able to do the smaller life. It was simply not in her. Nathan, on his side of the fence, was having his own version of the same reckoning. He'd heard what Frank Bauer had said. It had gotten back to him through 2 people, neither of whom had delivered it with particular enjoyment. He'd sat with it and turned it over and assessed it the way he assessed any difficult information, looking for the true part and the not true part, and trying to separate them. The true part: he was 56. Elena was 26. That gap was real, and it had practical implications that weren't going away. The not true part: that he was chasing anything, that this was about loneliness or vanity or the particular foolishness of older men with younger women. That Elena Brooks, who was one of the more clear-eyed people he'd ever encountered, didn't know exactly what she was doing. He was still uncertain. He was uncertain about most of the details. But he had arrived, somewhere in the weeks since the apple pie and the 7 words and the coffee on the porch and the soup at the kitchen table, at a place where he was no longer certain that his own uncertainty was enough reason to walk away. He'd spent 3 years walking away from things. He was getting tired of it. He told himself he was still thinking. He was still working through it. But on the Thursday of the second week after the soup dinner, he found himself repairing Elena's broken gate latch. The main ranch gate, not their shared fence, a piece of hardware that had been stiff and unreliable since August. And he did it without thinking too hard about what it meant that he'd noticed it needed doing and had simply done it, without being asked, without planning to mention it. It was snowing lightly when he finished. The first proper snow of the season, the kind that stuck and changed the color of everything from dead gold to white. He stood at her gate for a moment, in the quiet that only came with snow, and looked up at her house, lights on inside, truck in the drive, smoke from the chimney. He thought, "You're not being sensible about this." He thought, "No, I'm not." He latched the gate from the outside and walked back across the field to his own place, and the snow came down and covered his tracks, and somewhere behind him in that house, Elena Brooks was sitting at her kitchen table going through the accounts with a mug of tea, and she didn't know he'd been there, and he wasn't going to tell her yet. He was still working up to the part where he said things out loud. He was getting closer. He fixed the gate latch on a Thursday and didn't tell her. He fixed the loose board on her barn door the following Monday, early enough that she was still inside, and he was back on his own property before her kitchen light came on. He wasn't sneaking. He told himself he wasn't sneaking. He was just not ready to have the conversation that came with being caught doing something that announced itself so clearly. Because what it announced was that he'd made a decision without quite making it formally. That somewhere between the soup at his kitchen table and the snow coming down on her fence line, the part of him that had been holding back had quietly, without ceremony, let go of something. He was still afraid. That hadn't changed. But he was doing things anyway, which was different from not being afraid, and which was, he was coming to understand, probably the most honest version of courage available to a man his age. Tuesday came, and Elena arrived with a loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in a kitchen towel, and she came up the porch steps without hesitating the way she hadn't hesitated since the soup. And he held the door, and she came inside, and she set the bread on his counter and turned around and said, without preamble, "You fixed my gate." He should have known she'd notice. She noticed everything about her place, the way anyone did who ran something alone and depended on knowing the state of every part of it. "Latch was sticking," he said, "since August." "I know. I noticed it in August." She looked at him. The particular look she used when she was deciding whether to push something or leave it. She left it. She sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee he poured without asking, and she said, "You also fixed the barn door." "That was before the latch." "I know. I noticed them in order." A pause. "Nathan." "What?" "Why didn't you just knock?" He sat down across from her. He turned his cup in his hands, the way he did when he was organizing thoughts that didn't want to be organized. "Because I wasn't ready to have the conversation that came after." "What conversation?" He looked at her. "The one where I say out loud that I've stopped trying to talk myself out of this." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a wind was working through the eaves, a low sound, more felt than heard. Elena's hands were wrapped around her mug, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not surprise exactly, but something careful, like a person who had been waiting for something and wasn't entirely sure how to receive it now that it had arrived. "You've stopped?" she said. "Mostly." He was honest because she would have seen through anything else. "There's still a voice, probably always will be, but I've stopped listening to it as the only voice." She breathed out slowly. Not dramatically. Elena didn't do drama. But he saw it. The breath of someone releasing something they'd been holding. "Okay," she said. Okay, he said. They sat with their coffee and the bread that was still faintly warm and the particular silence of two people who have said something true and are letting it settle. It was not a declaration. It was not a scene. There were no hands held across the table, no moment of undeniable electricity. What there was two people sitting in a kitchen on a cold Tuesday morning, drinking coffee, breathing the same air, and knowing, without quite saying it, that something had shifted permanently. That was enough. For now, it was enough. What it was not was private, because nothing in Harlan County stayed private for long, and the visible evidence of Nathan Wilder working on Elena Brooks' property, twice in the space of a week before sunrise, was exactly the kind of thing that people noticed and discussed and worked themselves into feelings about with impressive efficiency. Frank Bauer noticed because Frank Bauer made a habit of being out on his property at early hours, and because his southeastern pasture shared a view of the road that ran past both ranches. He saw Nathan's truck at Elena's gate on Thursday morning, and he mentioned it to his wife at breakfast, and his wife told her sister that afternoon, and by Thursday evening it had completed most of its circuit around Harlan and arrived in slightly distorted form at the Clive household, the Phelps post office, and the back booth of Ruth Ann's Cafe, where three women Elena's age sometimes gathered on weekday evenings. The three women, Jessie Carver, Marie Stoltz, and Lorna Phelps, who was Ruth Ann's daughter and had inherited her mother's talent for considered judgment, were in agreement that this was alarming, though they disagreed about the nature of the alarm. Jessie thought Elena was being reckless with her reputation. Marie thought Nathan Wilder was behaving inappropriately, though when pressed she couldn't specify exactly what the inappropriate behavior was. Lorna, who was the most thoughtful of the three, and who genuinely liked Elena, was worried in a different way, a quieter, more honest way that she didn't fully express because it was harder to articulate than the others. What Lorna was worried about was this: that Elena Brooks was a person who had been managing alone for a long time, and that alone for a long time could make a person mistake reliability for love, the way a piece of solid ground felt precious when everything else had been mud. She didn't say this at the booth. She thought it later, driving home, and she thought it hard enough that the next morning she called Elena. Elena answered on the second ring, already sounding like she'd been outside. Lorna. Morning, you got a minute? Depends on what for. Fair enough. I'll be quick. Lorna pulled her car to the side of the road because she drove badly when she was trying to say something difficult. I'm not calling because of what people are saying. I want you to know that. I'm calling because I want to ask you something directly, and I'd rather you be annoyed at me than wonder later if anyone cared enough to ask. A beat. Go ahead. Are you sure about this? Not about him being good enough or appropriate enough or any of that. I don't mean it that way. I mean, are you sure for yourself that this is what you actually want and not just what's available and solid and present when everything else has been hard? The line was quiet for long enough that Lorna started to worry she'd gone too far. Then Elena said, I've asked myself that, seriously, multiple times. And the answer is yes, I'm sure. She paused. There's a difference between needing something and choosing it, Lorna. I know what needing feels like. This is different. Lorna exhaled. Okay. Is that enough? It's enough. Another pause. For what it's worth, I think you're braver than most people here. They just don't recognize it as bravery because it doesn't look like what they expect. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you. That actually helps. They hung up, and Lorna sat on the side of the road for a minute, thinking about what bravery looked like when it was quiet and daily and had nothing to prove to anyone. And she thought that maybe the town of Harlan had spent so long watching for obvious things that it had lost the ability to recognize the subtle ones. Nathan did not hear about the cafe conversation or the Lorna phone call, but he was conducting his own version of it internally, which was less productive because internal conversations have no one to push back on you and tell you when you've started going in circles. He was going in circles. He would get to a clear place, a place where the facts were simple and the direction was obvious, and then some memory or some voice that sounded like reason would pull him back, and he'd find himself standing in the east pasture, staring at nothing with a fence tool in his hand that he'd forgotten he was holding. The memories weren't even bad ones. That was the complicated part. If grief had been the only thing keeping him in place, he might have dealt with it more cleanly. But the memories of Margaret weren't just sad. They were good. They were the warm, specific evidence of a life that had actually worked, that had been built with care, and losing it had taught him in the most direct possible way what it cost to love someone that completely. He knew the cost now. He hadn't known it at 26 when he'd married Margaret, hadn't known it the way you knew it after you'd paid it. And the knowledge sat in him differently than it would have sat in a younger man. It didn't make him not want to love someone again. It made him aware in every cell of what he was signing up for. That was the fear. Not the town's opinions, not his age, not really. It was the knowledge of what it cost, and the question of whether he was capable of paying it again. He was thinking about this on a Friday afternoon when Hector Ramos showed up at his door without calling, which was how Hector operated because Hector was 72 and had earned the right to operate however he wanted. Nathan let him in and put coffee on and didn't bother asking what he was there for because Hector would get to it when he got to it. He got to it on the second cup. "You're still in your head," Hector said. Statement, not question. "Some. What's left in there?" Nathan sat back. He looked at the table surface and thought about how to say what was actually true rather than what was easier to say. "I know what it costs to love someone. I've paid it once. I know how that goes." Hector was quiet for a moment. He had a face that had seen a great deal and had stopped being surprised by most of it. "You think it's going to go wrong. I think anything can go wrong. So you're going to refuse the thing to avoid losing the thing." Nathan looked at him. "That's the logic," Hector said, not unkindly. "I'm just saying it plain. When you say it plain, it sounds foolish. Most fears do from the outside." Nathan turned his cup on the table. The coffee was getting cold. "She's 26, Hector. I'm 56. The math is what it is. At some point, she's going to be—" "At some point," Hector interrupted quietly, "one of you is going to go first. That's true of every couple I've ever known. I watched my wife in that hospital bed for 6 weeks, and I would not trade a single day of the 40 years before it. Not 1-to-1. He paused to let that settle. "The cost is the cost. You pay it because the thing it bought was worth it. That's the only logic that makes any sense." Nathan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had settled into a low, steady thing that was neither threatening nor comforting, just present. The way the land was out here, present, ongoing, indifferent to the small decisions of the people who lived on top of it. "I've been fixing her fences," Nathan said, "without telling her, without being asked. I heard. The whole town heard. Probably." Hector almost smiled. "What does that tell you?" Nathan didn't answer because the answer was obvious. "Go talk to her," Hector said. "Not to her porch, not across a railing. Go knock on her door and say the things you've been not saying for however long you've been not saying them, and let her decide what to do with it." He stood up, taking his cup to the sink the way he always did, rinsing it, leaving it in the rack. "You're not protecting her by staying quiet. You're protecting yourself." Nathan heard the door close behind him. He sat at the table for another 20 minutes, in the way of a man who had received information he already knew and was deciding when to stop pretending he hadn't. Then he got up, found his jacket, and went out. He didn't drive. It was a quarter mile, and he walked it the way he'd watched Elena walk it every Tuesday for 3 years, through the gate, across the open ground, up the rise toward her house. The cold was serious by now, a real December cold with teeth in it, and the sky was the flat white of a sky that was thinking about more snow. Her truck was in the drive. The kitchen light was on. He knocked. She answered faster than he expected. She must have seen him coming across the field, and she opened the door and looked at him. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. He was out of breath slightly, not from the walk, but from the weight of having finally done the thing. "Nathan," she said, "I need to say something." She stepped back from the door. He came inside. The kitchen smelled like the bread she'd brought him 3 weeks ago. She must have made another one. And the house had the particular warmth of somewhere that was being actively lived in. Dishes in the rack, coat on the back of a chair, a book open face down on the counter. He stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at her and said, "I've been afraid." "I know," she said. "Not of you, not of the town, I know what this costs. I've paid it, and knowing the price is a different kind of thing than not knowing it." He stopped, reorganized. He was not a man who spoke in speeches, and he could feel himself losing the thread if he wasn't careful. I kept thinking that the fair thing, the right thing, was to leave you alone. Let you go towards something easier. Nathan, I'm not finished. He said it gently. She stopped. I kept thinking the fair thing was to step back. But somewhere in the last few weeks, I started to understand that stepping back wasn't fair. It was just safe. For me. He looked at her directly, the full weight of it. I've been doing things for you without being asked, without telling you, because I wasn't ready to stand in front of you and admit what those things meant. And that's cowardice, dressed up as consideration, but still cowardice. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena was standing with her back to the counter, and her arms at her sides, and her face was doing something he couldn't fully interpret, which was unusual because he'd gotten reasonably good at reading her. What do those things mean? She asked, quietly. Not a challenge, a real question. He breathed in, breathed out. They mean I don't want to be on the other side of that fence anymore, he said. They mean I've been trying to keep my distance from something I stopped wanting to be distant from a long time ago. They mean, he paused. You said 3 years ago, 20 years wouldn't change anything. I've been thinking about that since October. And I think what you meant was that the thing you were responding to wasn't my age. It was the rest of it. And the rest of it, that's what I want to bring to you, if you still want it. The silence stretched, long enough that he felt it in his chest. Then Elena said, I've been waiting for you to cross that fence for about a year. I know, I'm sorry it took this long. You got here, she said. That's what counts. She crossed the kitchen, not dramatically, not with any of the weight the moment probably deserved, and she put her hand flat on his chest, over the jacket, over the sternum, just resting there. He put his hand over hers, both of them warm now, in the kitchen heat. I'm not easy, he said. One more time, because he needed her to have heard it. Nathan Wilder, she said, looking up at him. I've been bringing you food in cold weather for 3 years. I know exactly what I'm getting into. He almost smiled, the same rusty, unpracticed thing from before, but slightly more natural this time, like the mechanism was starting to remember how it worked. The room at the end of the hall, he said. I've been cleaning it out, slowly. I'm not going to rush it, but I want you to know I'm making space for something new, not replacing anything, making room. I know the difference, she said. I know you do. They stood in her kitchen with her hand on his chest and his hand over hers and the bread cooling on the counter and the kitchen light steady overhead, and it was not romantic in the way that movies made things romantic, with their particular lighting and their convenient music. It was two specific people in a specific kitchen with all their specific history and all their specific damage, choosing each other anyway. He stayed for dinner. She made the bread into toast, and they ate with leftover soup she had in the refrigerator, and it was, like most honest things, both simpler and harder than he'd imagined it would be. Simple because being there was easy in a way he hadn't expected. Hard because every few minutes he caught himself looking for the exit, the old habit of retreat, and had to consciously decide to stay in his chair. He stayed in his chair. After dinner, they sat at the table with the last of the coffee, and he told her, because they were doing this honestly or not at all, about the September 15th visits, about how he'd always known she came and always left the barn door open and never asked her to explain herself or to stop, about what that had meant to him before he was ready to admit it meant anything. You noticed, she said, every year. I didn't know if you wanted me to keep doing it. I did, he said. I always did. He looked at his cup. It was the one day I let myself just receive something, without arguing about whether I deserved it. Elena looked at him for a long moment. You deserve it, she said. The receiving, not just one day a year. He didn't have an answer for that, but he didn't deflect it either, which was different from before. He drove home late, the roads empty, the sky finally delivering on its snow promise in the form of a light, serious fall that was going to stick. He sat in the drive for a moment after he turned the engine off, looking at his house. It was a good house. He'd always known that, in a functional way. But sitting there now, it looked different, the way things sometimes look different after you'd made a decision about them. Larger, maybe. More like something that could hold more than one person's life. He went inside and walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of the end room, which was clean now, dusted, the window uncovered, the objects exactly where they'd always been, but breathable again. He looked at it for a minute. "I'm still here," he said quietly. Not to the room, to whoever might be listening from somewhere he didn't have language for. "I'm not forgetting, I'm just not standing still anymore." He went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could track, he slept straight through. Across the field, in her own house, Elena Brooks lay awake for a while in the specific, pleasant way of someone whose mind was too full to want to sleep. She thought about his hand over hers. She thought about the word space and the care with which he'd used it. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years learning how to be alone and had finally decided, with everything he knew about the cost of that decision, that being alone was the wrong choice. She thought, he knows what he's giving up. He's choosing this anyway. That meant more to her than anything. She turned out the light, and the dark came in, and outside the snow was falling steadily over both their properties, covering everything evenly, indifferent to fences. The county woke the next morning to 6 inches and a sky that had cleared overnight to the particular sharp blue that came after snow, the kind that made everything look like it had been cut out of something cleaner than the world usually offered. Elena was out before dawn checking the horses. Nathan was out at the same time checking his cattle. At some point mid-morning, they both ended up at the fence line at the same moment. This had happened before, over 3 years. They'd wave, exchange a few words about the weather, go back to their respective work. This time, Nathan opened the gate and walked through to her side and stood next to her while she checked the water trough heater, and she moved over without comment to give him room, and he looked at what she was looking at and said, "You need a new element in this." "I know. I've been putting it off. I can do it tomorrow if you've got the part." "I ordered one in October." He nodded. That was that. They stood together in the sharp cold and the new snow with their breath making small clouds, and the cattle on his side moving slowly through the white field and the horses on her side watching from the gate with their mild, interested expressions. And it was not a dramatic morning. Nothing about it would have looked significant to anyone watching. But something about it was completely different from every morning that had come before it, and both of them knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. The water trough element got replaced on a Tuesday, which meant it wasn't a delivery day, which meant Elena spent the morning working nearby and handing Nathan tools when he needed them and not making a thing of it, and he spent the morning replacing the element and not making a thing of it either. And by noon it was done, and they ate lunch at her kitchen table. Sandwiches she'd put together quickly, nothing elaborate. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, except that 3 months ago it would have been impossible. That was how it started. Not with a declaration to the county, not with any announcement, just with the slow, practical accumulation of time spent in the same spaces, doing the work that needed doing, in the way of people who have decided that the simplest expression of how they feel is to show up and be useful. Word got around anyway. It always did. By the second week of December, Harlan had arrived at a consensus, not unanimous, but clear enough to have weight, that Nathan Wilder and Elena Brooks were together in some definitive sense, and the consensus was not, on the whole, comfortable with this. The discomfort expressed itself in the usual ways, in conversations that stopped when one of them entered a room, in the studied neutrality of people who normally would have been warmer, in the particular quality of attention that a small community directed at something it had decided to disapprove of. Elena felt it most at the feed store, where Dale Hutchins, who'd known her father and who had always been decent to her, was now noticeably cooler. Not rude, just cooler. The kind of cool that communicated clearly that something had changed in his estimation of her without him needing to say a word about what. She bought her supplies and loaded her truck and drove home and did not call Piper about it because there was nothing Piper could do and because she had already made her peace with the fact that this was going to cost her something socially. She'd known that going in. Knowing it and experiencing it were different things, but the difference wasn't enough to make her reconsider. What did bother her, more than she'd expected, was the conversation she had with Walt Pruitt on a Saturday morning in mid-December. Walt was not a man who offered opinions without being invited to. In 2 years of working for her, he had stuck to a policy of strict non-interference in anything that didn't involve the horses or the fences, and she had appreciated that about him enormously. So when he showed up on a Saturday and worked in silence for 2 hours and then, while they were both leaning on the paddock fence watching the horses, said, without looking at her, "People are talking," she knew it cost him something to say it. "I know," she said. Frank Bauer said some things at the co-op meeting Wednesday. What kind of things? Walt was quiet for a moment. He was a man who chose words carefully because he didn't have an unlimited supply of comfortable ones. He said Nathan Wilder had no business pursuing a young woman on her own, that it wasn't decent, that someone ought to say something to him directly. Elena felt something tighten in her jaw. Frank Bauer can mind his own cattle. I know that. Walt glanced at her sideways. I'm not repeating it because I agree. I'm repeating it because you should know what's being said and where. Did anyone push back? Hector Ramos told him to his face that he didn't know what he was talking about. Hector said, and this is pretty much word for word, that a man who'd spent 40 years building something decent on this land was exactly the kind of man worth knowing, and that Frank ought to try it sometime. Despite everything, Elena almost smiled. Good for Hector. He's a straight shooter. Walt pushed off the fence and picked up his gloves. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever else is happening, you're good people and you run a good place, and that's what matters to me. She looked at him. He wasn't looking back. He was pulling on his gloves, focused on that. But she understood that this was, for Walt Pruitt, an extraordinarily emotional speech. Thank you, Walt, she said. Don't make it a thing, he said, and went back to work. She stood at the fence for a few more minutes, watching the horses, feeling the particular complexity of being someone who had made a decision she was certain about, but who was still absorbing the full cost of it. She wasn't second-guessing herself. She just hadn't fully anticipated how heavy the weight of other people's disapproval could be when it came from people you'd known your whole life. She thought about calling Nathan, then she thought no. This was her weight to carry, not his. He had his own version of it on his side of the fence, and she didn't need him to manage hers. Nathan's version arrived in the form of Frank Bauer himself, which was both more direct and more uncomfortable. Bauer came to his property on a Wednesday afternoon in his truck, pulling up to the house like a man who had decided something and was executing on the decision before he had time to reconsider. Nathan watched him come from the barn doorway and thought, here we go. He went out to meet him because he wasn't the type to make a man come all the way to the door. Bauer was 64, heavy-set, with the look of a man who had worked hard all his life and expected the world to recognize it. He'd always been reasonably square with Nathan. Not close, but the kind of neighbor you counted on to behave correctly at a co-op meeting and to call if your cattle got onto his land. Nathan had a practical respect for him that didn't extend to friendship. Bauer got out of the truck and didn't offer his hand. Nathan. Frank. Cold. It is. Nathan waited. Bauer looked out at the south pasture, at the cattle standing in their placid clusters in the winter light. I'm going to say something, and I'd like you to hear me out before you respond. All right? I've known you, 15 years? You're a decent man, good rancher, always dealt square. I've got no complaints about you personally. He paused. But people are concerned about the situation with the Brooks girl. Nathan looked at him steadily. The situation. Whatever it is. What's going on? Bauer shifted his weight. She's 26 years old, Nathan. Her father's been dead less than 2 years. She's alone on that place, and she's working hard, and she doesn't need someone taking advantage of a situation where she might be... Stop. Nathan said it quietly. Not loudly, but with enough in it that Bauer stopped. I'm going to tell you something clearly, Frank. One time, Elena Brooks is 26 years old, and she has been running that ranch since before her father died, and she is one of the most clear-headed people I have ever known. She's not confused. She's not vulnerable in the way you're implying. She's not being taken advantage of. He held Bauer's gaze. Whatever you think of me, and I understand this is about me as much as it's about her, don't disrespect her by suggesting she doesn't know her own mind. Bauer's jaw tightened. There's an age gap that... I know the age gap, Frank. I live with the age gap. Nathan's voice stayed level. The level voice was the harder one. It cost more to keep than a raised one. I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm not asking for the county's blessing. What I'm asking is for you to go home and let two people manage their own lives. A silence stretched between them. Bauer looked at him, and something worked in the older man's face. Not capitulation exactly, but the reassessment that happened when you pushed at something and found it more solid than you'd expected. I've got nothing against you, Bauer said again, but it was quieter this time. Then act like it. Bauer got back in his truck. He sat there for a moment, engine running, and Nathan stood in the cold watching him, and then Bauer backed out and drove down the road, and Nathan exhaled once, slowly, and went back to the barn. He didn't tell Elena about Bauer's visit, not right away. Not because he was protecting her. He'd stopped doing that. But because he needed a day to let the anger settle before he could talk about it without the anger coming through. He didn't want her to think he was shaken. He wasn't shaken. He was furious in the specific, steady way that he got furious, which was worse than the explosive kind because it lasted longer. He told her the following Tuesday when she came with ginger cake. She'd branched out, was trying new things, and the ginger cake was genuinely excellent, though he would have eaten sawdust at that point. They were at his kitchen table, where they sat now most Tuesdays and some other days besides, and he told her about Bauer and what he'd said and what Nathan had said back, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. When he finished, she said, "You told him I know my own mind." "I did." "Thank you." It needed saying. She cut another piece of the cake, put it on his plate without asking, and said, "My version was Dale Hutchins being cold at the feed store, and Walt Pruitt giving me the most uncomfortable pep talk of my life. Walt's a good man. He really is." She looked at her own plate. "Nathan, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead. Are you okay? With all of it? Because I can handle my side, but I need to know you can handle yours." He looked at her. She was asking seriously, not as a test, not with any particular angle behind it, just asking. "I'm okay," he said. "I'm more than okay. When I'm not standing in a cold yard listening to Frank Bauer tell me things I didn't ask his opinion on." He paused. "The rest of it, what people think, I was never much of a person who shaped my life around what other people thought. I'm not going to start now." She seemed to relax, slightly, in the way that someone relaxed when they'd been carrying tension they hadn't fully acknowledged. "Good," she said. "That's what I needed to know." "What did you think I was going to say?" "I didn't know. That's why I asked." He looked at her across the table. This woman who asked direct questions and waited for honest answers and didn't fill silences with things that weren't true. And he thought that this was one of the things he'd been afraid of losing when he'd been afraid. Not love in the abstract. The specific texture of being known by a specific person. "I'm in this," he said, simply. "Whatever this is, I'm in it." She held his gaze. "Me too." Christmas came to Harlan the way it always came, with unreliable weather, an excess of food at the community hall gathering, and the particular suspension of normal hostilities that the season produced, even among people who'd been at odds for months. The gathering was at the hall on the 23rd, and Elena went because she always went, and Nathan went because he almost never went, but this year Elena asked him to, and he understood what she was asking. Not for protection, but for partnership, the public version of what they'd been building privately. He was not comfortable at community gatherings. He never had been. He managed them the way he managed most things that didn't come naturally, with preparation and endurance and the occasional strategic use of silence. He stood next to Elena for most of the evening and talked to Hector, who was genuinely happy to see them both, and to Lorna Phelps, who was warmer to Elena than Elena had expected and who had the grace to shake Nathan's hand without any performance around it. Frank Bauer was there with his wife. He and Nathan nodded to each other across the room in the way of men who have said what needed saying and are now in the business of coexisting. It was not warm, it was functional, which was enough. Ruth Ann Phelps spent most of the evening looking at them with an expression that Nathan couldn't classify, and that Elena, catching it across the room, described later as a person whose opinion is changing but won't admit it yet. Martha Clive said hello to Elena at the food table and said she looked well and asked about the horses, and Elena answered all of it straightforwardly, and Martha Clive went back to her corner with the particular expression of someone who had come prepared for something awkward and hadn't gotten it, and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. What the evening produced, on the whole, was not acceptance exactly. It was exposure. The community of Harlan had now been required to be in the same room with Nathan and Elena as a unit, and the world had not collapsed, and the food was still good, and the cold outside was still the same cold, and none of the things that anyone had predicted as consequences had materialized in any visible way. That was all it took sometimes. Not approval, just the evidence that life continued. On the way home, in Nathan's truck, because his had better heaters, and the night was deep cold, Elena sat in the passenger seat with her coat still on and said, "That wasn't as bad as I expected." "No," Nathan said. Bauer looked at me like he was trying to figure out what was wrong with me. "He's not a subtle man." Lorna was kind. She always has been, from what you've said. Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the darkness go by outside the window, the snow-covered fields, the occasional light from a ranch house set back from the road. "Hector told me," she said, "that you were one of the best men he knew. He told me that while you were getting drinks." Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "What did you say?" I said I agreed with him. The truck's heater was working steadily. Outside, the temperature was somewhere below 10. The road ahead was clear, slightly icy at the edges, and Nathan drove it the way he drove everything. Not aggressively, not tentatively, but with the practiced attention of someone who respected conditions and planned accordingly. "Hector's been talking a lot lately," he said. "He loves you." "I know." A pause. "I love him too, in the way men are allowed to without making it complicated." Elena smiled. It was a real one, the kind that happened without intention. "You should tell him that." "Maybe." "Not maybe. Tell him." She looked at him in the dark cab. "People don't hear those things enough. You know that." He glanced over at her. "Is this about Hector or about something else?" "Both, probably." He was quiet for a moment. The truck moved through the dark and the cold and the particular silence of winter on the plains, which was different from other silences. Deeper, more permanent feeling, like the land was holding its breath. "I'm glad you asked me to come tonight," he said. "Yeah? I wouldn't have gone otherwise." "I know. And I should have. Years ago, probably. I let things close down too much after." He didn't finish the sentence, but she knew what it ended with. "You came back," she said. "You gave me a reason to." She turned to look at him properly for a long moment. He was watching the road, lit faintly by the dashboard, his face in three-quarter profile, the silver of his hair picking up the light. He looked like what he was. A man who had been through things and was still here, still intact, still showing up. That was not a small thing. She'd known people half his age who hadn't managed it. "Nathan," she said. "What?" "Stop at the overlook." He glanced over. She was looking forward now, at the road. Without asking why, he pulled off at the overlook point just before the turn onto their road. A small gravel pull-off where the land dipped and the valley below was visible. All of it covered in snow, the scattered lights of the farms and houses looking like something careful had placed them. He put the truck in park. They sat looking at it. The heater ran. The dark was enormous. "My dad brought me here when I was 8, Elena said. "First winter I can really remember being aware of how big the land was. He said, this is what we're taking care of. Not just ours, all of it, connected." Nathan looked at the valley. "I think he would have liked you," she said. He didn't answer right away. He thought about it with the care she deserved. "Tell me something about him," he said finally. So she did. She told him about her father. Not the grief version, not the eulogy version, but the real version. The man who burned everything he cooked and was too proud to admit it. The man who talked to the horses more than to most people and thought this was perfectly reasonable. The man who had told her, when she was 17 and furious about something she couldn't now remember, that being right wasn't the same as being kind and that she needed to learn the difference. Nathan listened without filling the spaces. He was good at that, genuinely good, not performing patience, but actually present. When she finished, she felt lighter, the way you felt after carrying something down from a high place. "He sounds like someone worth missing," Nathan said. "He is." She looked at the valley. "You know the hardest part? Not the work, not the money stuff, not even the loneliness. The hardest part is when something goes right. When the horses are all doing well or the accounts balance or a fence repair holds through a bad storm, and I want to tell him, and I can't." Nathan reached over and put his hand over hers, where it was resting on the console. Not dramatically, just placed it there, the same way she'd placed hers on his chest in her kitchen, warm and solid and present. "Tell me," he said. "When those things happen, tell me." She looked at his hand on hers. She turned her hand over so they were palm to palm. "I will," she said. She can. They sat at the overlook for a while longer. long enough that the cold started finding its way past the heater, and then Nathan started the truck and drove them home. He pulled into her drive and she got out and he walked her to the door, which he'd never done before. And at the door she turned around. The kiss, when it happened, was not the dramatic thing that months of buildup might have promised. It was quiet, brief, cold-nosed, slightly awkward in the way first kisses always were, even when they were years in the making. His hands were on her shoulders, and hers were briefly at his chest, and the cold air was going around both of them. When they stepped back, she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and they both looked slightly surprised, which made her laugh. A short, real, unguarded sound. And that broke whatever was left of the tension, and he smiled. The full version, both sides, the one that changed his face completely. "Okay," she said. "Good." "Yeah," he said. "Good." She went inside. He went back to his truck. He drove the quarter-mile home and walked into his house and stood in his kitchen for a minute in the way he sometimes stood in rooms. But this time, it was not because he'd forgotten why he was there. It was because he wanted to register the moment before it became ordinary. He went down the hall and looked in at the end room, the clean room, the open room, and then went to bed and lay there in the dark, not circling, not cataloging fears, just breathing. January came in with a hard freeze that cracked 2 of Nathan's water lines and sent both of them out in the pre-dawn cold to manage it. They worked side by side for 3 hours in the dark, in temperatures that made the work punishing, and nobody said much because there wasn't room for conversation inside the focus that the work demanded. By the time the lines were patched and the troughs were running again, the sky had gone from black to deep blue, and Elena's face was reddened with cold, and Nathan's gloves had a tear at the left thumb from where he'd caught it on a sharp pipe fitting. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked at his hand. "It's nothing. Come inside." "Elena?" "Come inside, Nathan." He came inside. She found the first aid kit in the cabinet above the refrigerator and cleaned the cut and put a bandage on it with the efficient, unfussy manner of someone who had dealt with 100 minor injuries alone and knew exactly how much attention each one warranted. He sat on the kitchen stool and let her do it without arguing, which was its own kind of progress. "You need better gloves," she said. "Those are good gloves. They have a hole in them. They're still good gloves. One hole." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the full attention look that she had come to know meant he was actually present, not distracted, not somewhere else. "Stubborn," she said. "So I've been told." She put the first aid kit away and poured them both coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table as the light came fully up outside, their wet boots by the door, their coats drying on the chair backs, both of them tired and cold-warmed and entirely at home. This was what they were building. Not a romance in the way the word usually meant. Not the glossy, curated version of it. Something harder and more specific. A life, in the practical sense. The kind made of early mornings and busted water lines and coffee that was sometimes too strong because one of them had been distracted measuring, and conversations that were sometimes difficult and sometimes not conversations at all, but just 2 people being in the same room and finding that enough. The county's opinions had not disappeared. They had quieted the way opinions did when they stopped being fed by drama and were forced to reckon with the boring persistence of reality. Bauer had not come back. Ruth Ann had thawed, incrementally, in the way of someone who had decided that disapproval was more exhausting than adjustment. Martha Clive had said something to her sister about Elena seeming settled, which was not exactly endorsement, but was not opposition either. The ones who'd been in their corner from the beginning, Hector, Walt, Lorna, were simply there. Steady. The kind of support that didn't announce itself but showed up in the small, reliable ways that mattered more than any public statement. Nathan had started leaving the porch light on when he knew she was coming. Not the front light, the side light, the one above the kitchen door, warm yellow, visible from across the field. She'd noticed it the first time and hadn't said anything because some things were better received in silence, as he had taught her by example. He'd also started keeping milk in his refrigerator. Just a small carton, always fresh. She took her coffee with milk. He didn't. He kept it anyway. These were the things that nobody saw. The small private ones that didn't make it into anyone's conversation at the post office or the cafe. And these were, in the end, the ones that mattered most. Not the grand gestures, not the confrontation with Bauer, not the community hall at Christmas. The milk in the refrigerator, the porch light on, the hand over hers on the console of a truck on a winter road. This was what it actually looked like. Two people choosing each other in the middle of a life that had not been arranged for it, amid the noise of people who thought they knew better. Inside the cold and the work and the dailiness of a place that made no allowances for what you hoped or what you feared. It wasn't easy. Some days it was actively hard. But it was real in a way that easy things rarely were, and both of them knew the difference between a thing that was real and a thing that was convenient, and they had each, separately and together, decided long ago that convenient wasn't enough. The porch light was on when she came through the gate on a Tuesday in late January, the cold so sharp it felt like it had edges. She could see it from all the way across the field, small and yellow and steady. She walked toward it. The proposal happened in March, and it was nothing like anything either of them had imagined, which was appropriate because neither of them had spent much time imagining it. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that came in early spring on the plains, cold still, but with something underneath the cold that had shifted, some quality of the light that was different from February's light, less defeated. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The ground was soft in places, and the mud was the particular rich mud of thaw, and the horses were restless in the way horses got when the season was about to change, and they could feel it before any human could measure it. Nathan had come through the gate at 7 with the specific purpose of helping Elena move 3 of her yearlings to the east pasture, a 2-person job that was difficult alone. They'd done it together, 30 minutes of actual work, the kind that required communication in shorthand, the kind they'd developed without planning to, where a look or a shift in position communicated more efficiently than words. The yearlings were moved. The gate was latched. They were standing at the fence, both slightly out of breath, and the morning light was doing what morning light did in early spring, slanting in low and gold and making everything look more significant than it was. Nathan said without looking at her, "I want to take the fence down." She looked at him. "Which fence?" "The one between our properties." He was still looking at the yearlings settling into the east pasture. "Not all of it, just the middle section. Open it up." He paused. "It would make more operational sense. Share the grazing, coordinate the cattle runs. Stop driving around the long way to get from one place to the other." Elena was quiet for a moment. "That's a very practical way to propose to someone." He looked at her then. The side of his mouth moved. "I wasn't—" He stopped. "I was working up to the other part." "Work faster." He turned to face her fully. He didn't have a speech. He'd thought about having a speech and had discarded the idea because speeches required a performance he wasn't capable of without it coming out wrong. What he had instead was the truth, which was less elegant, but more his. "I want to build something with you," he said. "Not because I need someone. Not because the place is easier with 2 people, though it is. Because when I think about the next 20 years, or 10, or however many there are, I can't make the picture work without you in it. You've been in the picture for 3 years already. I just want to make it official." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was on his face, and he looked steady and uncertain at once, the way he looked when he was doing something that cost him something. "The fence idea is still pretty romantic, Nathan." "It was a metaphor." "Was it?" "Mostly." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring. Plain, silver, a single stone that wasn't large, the kind chosen by someone who'd paid attention to the person he was giving it to and understood that she wouldn't want anything that got in the way of working with her hands. "Margaret's ring was different," he said. "I want you to know I didn't. This is yours. Just yours. I had it made." She looked at the ring in his palm. Then she looked at his face. "Yes," she said. Not after a long pause. Not with drama. Just yes, direct and clean, the way she said most things. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He'd guessed from the size of her hands, which he'd looked at enough over 3 years to have a reasonable estimate, and he'd been right. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him, and she put both hands on his face the way you held something you intended to keep, and kissed him in the cold spring morning air with the horses moving behind them and the mud soft underfoot and nothing about it remotely cinematic. It was better than cinematic. It was real. They told Hector first because Hector had earned it. He shook Nathan's hand and held it for a moment and looked at him with the specific expression of an old man who had watched a younger man come back from a long, dark way. And what was in that expression was not sentiment exactly, but something more serious than sentiment, Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of a hard thing done. Then he hugged Elena, briefly and firmly, the way her father might have, and she let herself feel that without making it complicated. Deb Calloway said, "Finally," when Elena told her, and then went straight back to the accounts because Deb's version of emotional support was competent efficiency, which Elena had always found more comforting than she probably should. Walt Pruitt nodded once, said good, and went back to work on the paddock gate he'd been repairing. But Elena noticed he was singing under his breath for the rest of the morning, a thing she had never once heard him do in 2 years. Piper called from Denver and screamed briefly, which was so uncharacteristic that Elena held the phone away from her ear and then laughed so hard she had to sit down. The rest of Harlan found out the way Harlan always found out. Through Ruth Ann at the post office, who had spotted the ring on a Wednesday morning when Elena came in for her mail, and who had the news through 3 channels before Elena was back in her truck. The response was mixed, predictably, but the proportion had shifted. There was more quiet acceptance than there had been in December, and the opposition, while not gone, had lost the conviction that came with novelty. People had watched these two for months now. The expected catastrophes had not materialized. The expected dysfunction had not appeared. What had appeared was 2 people who showed up for each other in the ordinary, unglamorous ways that actually constituted a life. Frank Bauer ran into Nathan at the co-op in April and did not bring up anything objectionable. They talked about spring cattle prices for 4 minutes. It was sufficient. They were married in June on Elena's property because it was hers, and she'd built something there that she was proud of, and she wanted to be married in a place that meant something. The ceremony was small. Hector, Deb, Walt, Lorna, Piper, who drove up from Denver in a car, held together by determination, and a handful of others who had earned the right to be there through the consistency of their support. A county judge named Eleanor Marsh, who was 70 years old and had married people in this valley for 3 decades and had seen enough to not waste words, said what needed saying in about 4 minutes. Nathan wore the good shirt that Elena had looked at in the store in town and not said anything about, but which had appeared in his closet somehow. She wore a dress that was not a wedding dress exactly, but was a dress she'd bought herself without telling anyone what it was for, and it was the color of the late afternoon sky in summer. And she looked in the mirror the morning of and thought, I look like someone who knows where she's going. The ceremony itself was imperfect in the way of real things. Piper cried before the vows started, which set off a chain reaction that eventually reached Hector, who did not cry, but whose face rearranged itself into something that was doing a great deal of work. Nathan held Elena's hands and looked at her and said the words the judge prompted him to say, but he added, quietly, in the moment between the prompted words and the conclusion, in the voice he used when he was saying something true, I'll show up. That's what I'm promising. Whatever comes, I'll show up. She pressed her hands into his and said, I know, me too. Eleanor Marsh pronounced them married, and that was that. And someone opened a bottle, and the afternoon sun came down on Elena's pasture, and the horses watched from their paddock with their usual philosophical indifference. And nobody made speeches because neither Nathan nor Elena was a person who responded well to speeches. Later, after everyone had gone and the evening was coming down over the fields, they stood on the porch of what was now, formally, their shared life, and looked out at the land. Both ranches were visible from here. Elena's house where they stood, Nathan's house across the field, the fence between them still mostly intact because taking it down was a project, and projects took time, but the gate stood open, the hinged gate he'd built 3 years ago without being asked, and it had been standing open for months. We should start on the fence next week, Nathan said. The middle section first. That'll take a day, maybe 2. We've got time. He looked at her sideways. She was leaning on the porch rail, looking out, the color of her dress going gold in the evening light. And he thought, the way he sometimes thought things he didn't say, though he was getting better about saying them, that the picture he'd described to her in the winter, the one that didn't work without her in it, was right there in front of him, and it looked exactly as he'd needed it to. What are you thinking? She asked, without looking at him. He considered lying in the comfortable way, saying nothing or the fence or some other deflection. He didn't. I'm thinking that I almost missed this, he said. 3 years of Tuesdays, and I almost talked myself out of the whole thing. She was quiet for a moment. But you didn't. But I didn't. Hector helped. Hector helped, he agreed. You helped more. She looked at him. How did I help? You kept showing up. He said it simply. I kept waiting for you to get tired of it, to decide it wasn't worth it. And you just kept coming. Every Tuesday, with food and no expectations and no pressure and no pity. He paused. It's hard to keep telling yourself you're not worth showing up for when someone keeps showing up. Elena was quiet for a long moment. The evening was settling in, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and was answered and then was silent. I wasn't showing up for you, she said. What? I mean, I was. But that's not why I started. I started because I was lonely, Nathan. My dad was sick, and the ranch was hard, and I needed somewhere to walk to on Tuesdays that wasn't just more of my own four walls. She looked at her hands on the porch rail. You weren't a project. You weren't someone I was rescuing. You were just the person I ended up wanting to see. It happened gradually, and I didn't plan it, and it was inconvenient as hell, given everything. He looked at her. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. I'm telling you now. She looked up at him. The point is that neither of us was particularly noble about this. We were just two people who needed something and found it in the wrong-looking place and were stubborn enough not to walk away from it. She almost smiled. Mostly you. You were the stubborn one. You brought me food 41 weeks in a row. That was determination, not stubbornness. There's a difference. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She made the sound that was almost a laugh back at him. They stood on the porch in the ending of their first evening as married people, and the land spread out around them, big and indifferent and beautiful, and neither of them had the language for what they were feeling, so they just stood in it, which was enough. The year that followed was not the year of a fairy tale. It was the year of two operations merging, which was harder than either of them had fully anticipated, even though both of them had gone in with their eyes open. There were disagreements about money. Nathan was cautious with it, in a way that sometimes read as withholding. Elena was strategic in a way that sometimes read as reckless. And the truth was somewhere between those two characterizations and required actual conversation to locate, which they had, more than once, with raised voices, and then with calmer voices, and then with coffee, and the particular silence of two people who have argued properly and come out the other side knowing more than they knew before. There were disagreements about the cattle operation, about when to sell, about which pastures to rest, about a breeding decision in the fall that Nathan was certain about and Elena was skeptical of, and which turned out 6 months later to have gone Nathan's way, which he did not rub in because he'd been wrong about 3 other things in the meantime, and they were keeping an informal ledger. There were harder things than disagreements. There was a September 15th that came around, Nathan's second with Elena as his wife. And it was still the day it had always been, still marked, still heavy in a specific way that no amount of happiness could fully displace. Elena didn't try to displace it. She got up early and made coffee and put it on the table and went out to do the morning work and left him to be in it. And when she came back in, he was sitting at the kitchen table looking at the photograph that had moved from the end of hall room to the kitchen shelf, where it lived now. Not hidden, not displaced, just present. I talked to her, he said. Elena sat down across from him. What did you say? I told her I was okay. He looked at the photograph. I told her about you. He paused. I hope that's not strange. It's not strange. I told her you bring better coffee than I ever made. That's true. She would have thought you were something, he said, still looking at the photograph. She would have liked your stubbornness. She would have liked that you don't soften things. Elena looked at the photograph. A woman and a man, 15 years younger, at a county fair, both squinting into the sun. She could see Nathan in it, the posture, the hands, the steadiness, even in a casual photo. She built something good with you, Elena said. She did. I'm planning to do the same. He finally looked at her. The morning light was coming in through the kitchen window, and the coffee was getting cold, and outside the horses were moving in the paddock. Their horses now, the combined herd of 2 places become one. And his face had that look, the one she'd first really seen on the porch the morning of the cornbread, when he'd started to come back from somewhere far away. Present. Here. Choosing to be here. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. The fence came down in sections over the course of that year. Not all at once, but piece by piece as the operational logic demanded it, and what had been two separate ranches became something that functioned as one without losing the distinctness of its parts. Nathan's cattle operation expanded into the consolidated grazing land. Elena's financial management brought an order to the books that the combined place had needed, and that Nathan, who understood cattle and weather and land better than he'd ever understood accounting, was genuinely grateful for without always knowing how to say so. She told him. She made him say it. "Just say thank you," she told him once, when he'd expressed gratitude through the medium of fixing something she'd mentioned needing fixed. "I'll take the fence repair. I also want the words." "Thank you," he said, slightly uncomfortable. "Better. You're going to keep making me do that." Every time. He made the sound. She made the sound back. This had become one of the rhythms of their life, his discomfort with the direct expression of things, her insistence on it anyway, and his gradual grumbling improvement. The baby was not planned. That was the truth of it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. When Elena went quiet on a Tuesday morning in the following spring, not withdrawn, just inward, processing something, and then said to him across the breakfast table with the particular care of someone delivering information that is going to change things, "I need to tell you something." Nathan set down his coffee and waited. She told him. He was quiet for long enough that she started to read the silence wrong, and she said, "Nathan, I'm here," he said. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just..." He stopped, started again. "I'm 58 years old. I know how old you are. I didn't think..." Another stop. "I didn't think this was going to happen." "Neither did I." She held his gaze. It's something I didn't know I still wanted," he said, slowly, finding the words as he went. "And now that it's here, I understand that I did. Want it." He looked at her. "We're going to have a kid." "We are." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood up, and he held her the way he didn't always let himself hold people, without reserve, without the careful management of how much he revealed. And she felt the full weight of him, which was considerable. "Okay," he said into her hair. "Okay. You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." The pregnancy was not easy. Elena worked too hard and Nathan worried too much, and they argued about both of those things with the energy of two people who had strong opinions and a shared stake in the outcome. She cut back on some things. Not all things. She was not a person who cut back on all things, but some. He took on more. They recalibrated, the way they recalibrated everything, through negotiation and stubbornness and the occasional raised voice that resolved into something more honest than the starting position. The boy was born in January, which Nathan said was appropriate because January was when you found out what things were actually made of. They named him James, which had been Elena's father's name, and Nathan held him in the hospital room with the careful, slightly terrified expression of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding and took that weight seriously. Hector came to see them at the ranch 3 days after they came home, in the way of a man who didn't make hospital visits but showed up where people lived. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the boy in Elena's arms, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathan and said, "You did good." Nathan said, "He did most of the work." He meant the boy. He also meant Elena, and Hector understood that. James Wilder grew the way children did on working ranches, fast and physical, and with opinions about everything, and with the particular confidence of a child who had been wanted and was daily shown it. He had Nathan's serious eyes and Elena's stubbornness and a laugh that belonged to no one they could identify. That was entirely his own. Nathan took him out with the cattle from the time he could walk, the same way he'd learned himself, explaining things in the patient, precise way he explained everything, and James absorbed it with the seriousness of a child who understood that what he was being taught mattered. Elena watched them sometimes from the kitchen window. The old man and the small boy, moving through the field together, Nathan pointing at something and James looking where he pointed with total attention. And she thought about apple pie and fence gates and 7 words said calmly on an autumn morning and the long, improbable chain of Tuesdays that had led here. She thought about what her father had said at the Overlook, about taking care of all of it, the land connected. She thought that this was what he'd meant, maybe, not just the acreage, but the people on it, and the people they made, and the way that a life built with intention sent things forward into years you wouldn't be there to see. She thought about fear, about how Nathan had been so afraid of the cost of love that he'd nearly refused to pay it, and how that fear had made complete sense from the inside and looked, from the outside, like a man trying to hold water in closed fists. She thought about herself at 26, walking across a field in the cold with a pie in a basket, not knowing exactly what she was walking toward, just knowing she was walking toward it. Nobody knew what they were getting into. That was the thing about it. You could be cautious and calculate and still not know. The cost arrived with the experience, not before it, and the only way to know if something was worth it was to find out. Nathan came in from the field with James on his shoulders, which he shouldn't have been doing at 59 with a back that had opinions about such things, and which he did anyway because James asked, and because the back, like most things, could be managed. He bent carefully at the kitchen door, and James slid down and ran through the house with the energy of a 4-year-old who had been outdoors for 2 hours and was now ready to be indoors very loudly. Nathan straightened and looked at Elena at the counter and said, "Back's fine before you say it." "I wasn't going to say it." "You were thinking it." "I was also thinking lunch." He came over and looked at what she was making and picked a piece of something off the cutting board, and she hit his hand the way she always did, and he ate it anyway the way he always did. 42 years old now, she had 3 lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before James, and her hair was shorter, and she stood in the kitchen of their combined life with the ease of someone completely at home in it. He stood next to her and looked out the kitchen window at the fields. No fence between them now, just open ground running all the way to the tree line, the cattle moving across it, everything connected. And he thought about what he'd told Hector years ago when Hector had told him to go talk to her. He hadn't said anything to Hector then. The answer had been obvious. He put his hand on Elena's back, between her shoulder blades. She leaned back into it slightly, without stopping what she was doing. "Nathan," she said. "What?" "The west water line. It's making that sound again." "I'll look at it tomorrow." "You said that yesterday." "I'll look at it today." "Thank you." "You're going to make me say it every time." "Every time," she confirmed. He almost smiled. She almost smiled. From somewhere in the house, James yelled something that was probably a question about something they'd need to get up and deal with, and neither of them moved immediately, just stood another moment in their kitchen, in their life, in the middle of everything it had cost to build. The land outside was indifferent to it, the way land was indifferent to everything. It didn't know what it had taken. It didn't know about the apple pies, or the fence gate, or the 7 words, or the 30 years between them, or the opinions of Harlan County, or the stone in a man's chest, or the stubborn woman who had walked across a cold field 41 Tuesdays in a row before he was ready to walk back. It was just land. It didn't know any of it, but it held all of it anyway, the way land holds everything. The grief and the courage and the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of people who chose each other and then kept choosing, against the odds and the fear and the voice that said it wasn't worth it. It was worth it. That was the whole story. That was all of it. Worth it.
Dang. Chandler might have been able to TP him, but I don't know if he...
Oh my god, Chandler could have saved me.
Did Brenda die?
He could have teleported me and saved me. Oh my god, bro. Oh my god, bro. There was a red dot on my head. Did he not think to fucking teleport me? Oh, when he goes into a cave, he loses signal.
Ben, do you have this thing on?
Dude, no one has a walkie. Ben died. He's talking to nobody. What the hell, man? he needs to watch out for the kidnapper fox too.
Oh my.
Holy.
Well, that's always fun.
Yeah,
It's a dead end anyways. There's one piece of loot in there.
I wonder if the kidnapper fox is gonna get him. Can't kill Blinn, he's essential for morale.
Yeah.
Exactly. Emotional support,
But-
Blinn.
You can avoid it, no. I already went in there. It's a dead end.
Chandler could have saved me,
Almost walked
bro.
to that landmine.
I'm pissed. There's so much loot in those caves.
And it's a dead end.
There's so much loot in there, bro. Brayden, how you been? How was your day?
Wow. Wow.
They were looking for you all day for Terraria, bro.
Aw, man. I don't have a key.
I don't have one either. There's a monster.
I think it's a sport lizard. So this one just has nothing in it?
Yeah.
Wow, bro, what the fuck?
Okay, I finally got drinks at that Etlier place. The what? What is that, Brayden?